Welcome to part one of Learning to Learn at Home, a short course that's designed to help young people, anyone really, but young people in particular, get better at learning stuff. And in particular, how to get better at learning stuff independently so that they can learn what they want, when they want to, or when they need to, rather than having to be told what to do and when and how all the time. Learning to learn is a world that I've been involved in for a number of years now, and it's a fascinating world, as I'm sure you'll agree. This first episode is called Mapping the Journey, and that's for two reasons. Number one, because there's an activity of that name that will come at the end of this video, and secondly, because in this introductory video, I will chart the course that this short series of about 10 videos will take. I'll also outline some of the research that underpins our work. I work with schools a lot, and I have done for a number of years, and I often ask teachers and school leaders this question: if you could wave a magic wand, or if you could snap your fingers, what's the one thing that you would change about your pupils? Often they say things like, I want them to be more knowledgeable, or I want them to read for pleasure, and they're really good things to wish for. But this video is about something else, because whenever we ask this question, you often hear answers that are kind of like a variation on a theme, the kind of responses that you see on this slide. This word independence often comes up. I want them to be more independent, I want them to be more confident or proactive. The language of spoon feeding arises quite a lot. People often say, I wish that they weren't so needy, or I wish that I didn't feel like I have to just tell them what to do and when all the time. That the children are sometimes quite helpless. So for example, they come up and say, my pencil is broken, rather than just going and sharpening their pencil, or asking questions like, what should I do with the rubbish? And this isn't surprising in a way, because there's something interesting about the way that schools work. Children don't know what they don't know. And so naturally, teachers and school leaders set the agenda for what needs to be learned and by when and how and so on. And that makes for an efficient use of time, but it has this sort of unfortunate side effect whereby the children become so reliant and dependent on being told what to do and when and how that they don't learn how to do things very independently. We also hear lots of language around failure and the fear of failure, and this phrase that a teacher recently used, the resident evil of fear of failure. I'm sure that this will be familiar to anybody who works in schools, that the fear of getting things wrong is really strong among young people. So if you say, for example, to a child, why did you not get involved in that class discussion, or why did you not put your hand up? You know that you knew the answer to that question. And they say things like, I was 99% sure, but there's 1% of me that just wasn't quite sure, and I just didn't want to put my hand up in case I get it wrong and people will laugh at me. I don't want to look foolish. You also see things like children who will, instead of crossing a single word out if they make a spelling mistake, they'll tear the whole page out of their exercise book and write the whole thing again. It's almost like they come to see any little mistake as a sign of weakness and something that's to be covered up and avoided at all costs. It's almost like an irrational fear that kicks in, kind of like an overcorrection. Helping children overcome this fear of failure is almost like the big idea that underpins this whole course. We'll come back to that later on in the series. The way that I got into this world of learning to learn is that I was a secondary school teacher, and about 10 years ago, the head teacher of the school that I was working in sent an email out to all staff saying, who wants to get involved in designing and teaching a learning to learn curriculum for all children in year 7? So I applied to be a part of this team along with a number of other people. So we had this dedicated team of teachers, and we were given the whole of year 7 for 5 lessons a week to do with what we wanted. And when those children progressed into year 8, the curriculum time expanded with them, and then again into year 9. So over the course of 3 years, these children took part in over 400 learning to learn lessons, which was incredible, really. As this image suggests, we started out this process with a few ideas for what we might put into this program, but also a lot of questions. And essentially, we tried lots of different approaches, and then we combined them together in what's referred to as a complex intervention, which very simply just means an intervention with many moving parts. And the basic idea is the incremental marginal gains that arise from each of the individual things that we were doing would stack up and interact, and you'll get this bigger effect size overall. Well, that was the theory anyway, and indeed that's what turned out to happen. So I evaluated the impact of this thing, which became known as the Learning Skills Curriculum, over 8 years as the focus of my PhD. We followed 4 cohorts of children from year 7 through to year 11, 1 control cohort, and then 3 learning to learn cohorts. And that evaluation found that the Learning Skills Curriculum led to significant gains in subject learning across the curriculum, and in particular with accelerated gains among children from disadvantaged backgrounds. So there's this widespread problem within the education system that children from disadvantaged backgrounds tend to do worse than their peers, and that gap widens as they get older. And so the Learning to Learn curriculum closed that gap, and it closed it from the bottom up, which is good because there's more than one way to close a gap, and and we closed it in a good way. Since this study ended, we've taken this approach out into a whole range of different contexts, from early years settings right the way through to higher education. We work with schools in disadvantaged areas and also with elite international colleges. We've taken it into workplaces and refugee camps. It's almost like a universal approach to helping anyone, child or adult, get better at learning stuff and get better at learning stuff independently. If you're interested in the research that underpins this has all been published in peer-reviewed journals. So this was the first publication that I wrote with my PhD supervisor, Professor Neil Mercer. This was the interim findings when that first cohort got to the end of year 9, and already we were seeing, as you can see in the title there, improved attainment and that closing of the disadvantage gap. When they got to GCSE 2 years later, we had that same pattern of improved attainment and a closing of the gap. So I eventually wrote this up into a PhD, which has a snappy title, as you can see here. And this slide, you'll be pleased to hear, is where the jargon begins and ends in this course. But it is worth pausing briefly to look at these 3 key words. Metacognition, people often refer to that as thinking about thinking, but it's more helpful, I think, to think of it in terms of reflecting on the how of learning. Self-regulation, and there's 2 big ideas here. The self-regulation of emotions to make sure that you're okay, that you're in the zone where you're able to learn, and if you are not in that zone, if you're feeling dysregulated or overwhelmed for some reason, that you know how to get back into that zone. And also regulation of behaviors, and in particular learning behaviors, and that involves things like setting goals and understanding how you might set about achieving those goals and monitoring your progress along the way and so on. It's essentially about taking ownership over the learning process. And the last big idea is oracy, which is about speaking and listening, helping the children to develop really effective spoken language and communication skills in a range of contexts, ranging from small group interactions and paired talk to being able to do a really good presentation, to standing at the front of a room or in an assembly, say, or taking part in a formal structured debate and so on. So these are the 3 big ideas that underpin our work. So Kate and I have recently written a book where we've tightened up the title a little bit. As you can see, Fear is the Mind Killer. This should be coming out later this year. Later in this sequence of videos, we'll come back to that big idea that sits underneath this about that endemic fear of failure. There's this amazing film, actually it's a terrible film, but it's an amazing book called June, where the title Fear is the Mind Killer comes from. So this is the general gist of what we're going to talk about in this series of videos, although when we get to project-based learning, it will probably turn into a series of videos, because that's where this thing really starts to grow legs and where the children really start to take ownership over their learning. And this, by the way, is a person whose actual name is General Gist, which is just one of my favorite things. So this video is called Mapping the Journey, and I'll explain why shortly. And then in the next video, Kate will introduce a quick win, a fantastic project about identity, the Who Am I project, that you can set your children off with. It can take them weeks, and it gives us a little bit of breathing space to work our way through the rest of this course. And it also gives you the opportunity to observe your child and to see what they're good at, what they're not so good at yet, in terms of working without supervision. Then we're going to look at self-regulation. Firstly, self-regulation of emotions and taking control of our nervous system, and then self-regulation of behavior. And in particular, we're going to look at family dynamics, which is really relevant to home learning. And we're going to look at something called the PAC model, the Parent Adult Child model, which is a really powerful way to understand how we interact and how we can interact in more healthy, productive ways. In episode 5, we'll look at this idea of scaffolding, an idea that's very widely used within the teaching profession, and it's essentially the method by which we provide support for young people and then gradually withdraw that support over time until they're able to do things on their own 2 feet. In episode 6, we'll look at talking with our children about the how of learning. In episode 7, we'll pull all of these ideas together and look at some practical tools for helping your children to make that journey towards becoming more self-directed, autonomous, independent learners. In episode 8, we're going to look at something called Steps to Success, and that will build upon the activity we're going to do today. So in mapping the journey, we're going to look at where we are now and where we want to be at some point in the future. And that's a really powerful activity to do, but it can also sometimes feel quite daunting, because it's like where we are now feels like it's a massive jump from where we want to be. So when we do Steps to Success, we're going to look at how to make that gradient really smooth and logical and stepwise. So that's where it starts to look like it's really doable. In episode 9, we'll refer back to this idea of fear is the mind killer and this widespread fear of failure, and helping children to recognize failure for what it is, which is feedback, essentially. And then in episode 10, we'll get into project-based learning, because that's what independent learning really looks like, isn't it? If you think about the world of work, a job is essentially a series of projects where, for example, you might be writing a new curriculum, or you might be working with a new client and trying to meet their particular needs, Or if you think about, you want to decorate your child's room, there's a series of problems that arise, aren't there? Like, where are we going to move all the furniture to? And how much paint do we need in order to cover that amount of walls and so on. And you solve these problems in sequence and then you tie the whole thing off. And projects can also include things like getting a really good grade in a particular subject at GCSE, but it's really about helping children to see their life as a series of projects that they are in control of. That's where the fun will really begin. So let's get started. This first activity is called Mapping the Journey, and this sheet here is a download for you to take away and to fill out in your own time. This is based on a tool that we use at the Institute of Education where I work, but we use in almost all of our programs, where we look at where we are now and where we want to be and how we're going to get from A to B. And it's important to start with the end in mind, so you fill out the left-hand side first and then go back to where you are now. And I want you to be really utopian in your thinking and to think, what would it be like if things in 5 years' time or 10 years' time or whatever age makes the most sense to you, age 16 or 18 or 21 or something, what would it be like if things were going as well as they possibly could? What would the best version of you look like at that age? And these questions are just suggestions. If you want to get rid of any, add some of your own, please feel free to do so. And really, these bottom questions are the most important. How would you feel in this imagined future when you've achieved all of these things, or when your child has achieved all of these things? And that's really important to really flesh that out and maybe try to think of 5 or 10 words that would describe your feelings in the future, because then we create like an emotional anchor that we're working towards. It's a really powerful thing to do. So when you've filled out the left-hand side of the sheet, then you turn your attention to where you are now. And as you can see, many of those questions are mirrored. And that final question there is about what kinds of things do you find yourself saying? What language fills your home currently when you're talking to your child about their learning, or about them reading, or about them helping out at home or tidying their room? What's it feel, taste and sound like at the moment in your home? So I strongly recommend that you download this, take it away and fill it out at a time of your convenience, and to do so together and to see if you can come up with a shared vision of what good will look like and what the current situation looks like. And please do let us know how you get on. You can either comment publicly at the Learning to Learn homepage, there's a link beneath the video, or you can message us privately, that's fine as well. We're really keen to hear your thoughts and your feedback. Thank you very much, and I look forward to seeing you next time.